My name is Christine Mungai. I'm a writer and journalist. I always introduce myself as a writer and journalist first. The other thing I do is curating this space here at Baraza Media Lab. I'm excited to be hosting this panel, and Jonathan gave us some background on where all this is coming from, a digitization project that's ongoing at Macmillan Memorial Library. Digitizing gazette notices, colonial photographs, all kinds of government documents, including county minutes, and importantly for this panel, newspapers, magazines, and other periodicals. As Bunk was taking this project of digitizing these documents, what they found is that there were some gaps emerging that were missing in the archive. What they were missing was the voices and the representation of and experiences of Kenyan people, and instead an overrepresentation of official voices, and it seems like Kenyan life was just institutions talking to each other, right? Rather than people being represented in the story of a nation. So this is what the Missing Bits project is all about, seeking to interrogate and to fill these gaps by crowdsourcing public memory around key events in Kenya's history, as well as in people's personal lives, in their family stories, in their photo albums, and in their lived experiences. So at Eastland's Library, I believe, they've set up some audio booths where they ask folks to come in and record family stories, right? Record, for example, what was your grandmother doing on Independence Morning? What was happening in 1975 when folks found out that JM was missing? These are kind of big moments in Kenya's history, but then there's also the ordinariness of Kenyan life that is not represented in our public archive. And this is what the Missing Bits project is trying to interrogate and to fill. Now, I said that a big part of the source of these documents and archives is newspapers, right? Is stuff that the media has put together, that journalists have written and have curated. We talk about the media being the first source of history, of journalists writing the first draft of history. And in this archive, many of these gaps emerge when analyzing newspapers and periodicals. This panel is going to interrogate how we got here in having an archive that seems to be officialdom, basically speaking to itself, and also interrogating the idea that the past is never truly past, that these legacies remain alive. We're here to unearth these hidden histories in our present-day imagination and to explore what has changed and what hasn't changed in our media reporting, and to trace the threads that remain alive today. So I hope I have made Bunk proud with that introduction. Yes. And so I want to introduce our panel real quick, and then we get into the conversation. Just as a signpost, Jonathan and Lisa, I believe, are going to be walking around with the microphone. When you have a question, just put the question not at the back of your mind, but at the front of your mind. Let me tell you what happens when you put it at the back of your mind. You actually forget what you wanted to say by the time you get the mic, and then you start rambling. And then you start saying, mine is a comment, I don't know what I'm saying, you know. So put it like right at the front, and we'll have 2 rounds of Q&A. So when I give the signal, the mic will go around. We'll take 2 or 3 questions in 2 rounds. So if you're not ready in the first round, there'll be a second round at the end of the conversation. I think everyone is comfortable for us to begin, yes? Good. So I'm really, really pleased to be joined with this, to be moderating this panel. I consider the people here on stage colleagues, mentors, seniors, and people I respect immensely. I'm really honored to be the one doing this. Parselelo Kantai, who is sitting right next to me, is a writer and journalist. He has covered East and West Africa for several newspapers and media houses, including the Africa Report, the Financial Times, Africa Confidential, and the New African, where he was editor. His short fiction has been published in a range of anthologies. He's currently working on a book about exiled liberation movements in Dar es Salaam in the 60s. Welcome, Parselelo. Lindy Mtongana is a South African broadcast journalist. She's worked in radio and television for over 15 years. Lindy has hosted prominent television shows on South Africa's TV station ENCA, as well as CGTN, which is China Global Television Network. Lindy also hosts a panel on transnational organized crime. Karibu sana. And lastly, we have Denis Galava. He is a journalist who was managing editor of Kenya's largest newspapers, both The Nation and The Standard. So he had stints at both publications. He has global expertise in journalism, research, and strategic communications. Denis recently completed his PhD at the University of Edinburgh and is currently a strategic communications consultant with the World Bank here in Nairobi. Join me in welcoming our panel today. All right, so I'm going to open this up by turning to Denis, who I've worked with as a colleague. He has been my editor, he has been my friend as well, and kind of in the trenches in some way together. I talked to you about Bunk's digitising project when we were preparing this panel of Kenyan people not being represented in the archives, and that these gaps emerge strongly when we analyze the periodicals. You know this cliche that journalists are writing the first draft of history. People say this a lot. You know, I can understand why colonial administrators wouldn't be interested in the opinions or in the stories of the Kenyan people, of the masses, right? But what would you say is the reason for the persistence of these gaps, even in the independence period? That these are not things that are ancient history, but that have kind of persisted through it.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, my dear co-panelists. Yes. I think we are looking at the question of evolution of the media in Kenya, which is also may apply to Africa. And perhaps I could say the cliche that journalists record history should now be buried because it should be or changed to journalists erase history every day.
Say more about that, Denis.
Yeah, precisely because that the nature of the media in Kenya was, the media was not founded to record the everyday life of a people. The media was founded as a commercial enterprise to communicate with the government, to amplify government's intentions, to call in colonialists, and while doing so, getting money from the government. So it was a tool for leveraging. Yeah. So we could say the train never left the station because the logic for the ownership remained the same. Come independence, like the colonial edifice, it was a change in personnel and not the logic. But then, if you walk back from the media reflects what happens in society every day. The entire machinery of government, of business, education, and culture remain the same. This is an elite space. It is a dialogue between the elites. So the public, the masses were to be spoken for, to spoken at and to. It was never for a conversation. So if we are looking for a story of Kenya or much of Africa, you'll need to look elsewhere. The everyday life of Kenya is not recorded in the media. And this is not a referenda of the media today. It is something that happens and will continue happening. So I recently concluded a study on the news cultures in Africa. And if you are to remove the geographical pin of the countries, it was almost the same idea that the print and broadcast media is a platform for elite. It's a conversation among the elite.
Negotiation.
The public are curious onlookers. So if
Are they innocent bystanders?
they're excited
Okay.
because they aspire to join the elite, only how they don't know or they're still in the struggle. However, the Kenya's or the African story is told on the periphery in rumor and gossip. So even right now, like in this election period in Kenya, if you want to know the story in Kenya, listen to the rumors and gossip. To borrow from Parselelo and Yvonne, Kenya has 4 languages, official languages. We have English, we have Kiswahili, then we have silence and now rumor.
Silence and rumors.
Yeah. So that's where the story of Kenya is told. Look to English and Kiswahili for the official narratives of posturing. So the archives are posturing. The train never left the station of where the media was founded. Thank you.
Parselelo, how does that land with you, what Denis just said, that the logic was never to represent the Kenyan people in the first place?
I mean, I think Denis I entirely agree with Denis. The media was, and I'm talking about the national media. You know, there was other media at different points in the mid-late colonialism, where you had indigenous media emerging purely for political negotiation. But what you have as we're coming up to independence, I think the story of the Nation specifically, the Nation Media Group, is absolutely iconic. And iconic as another element, another facet, another feature of the civilizing mission project in this country, where you have a media house being set up for wonderful intentions, wonderful reasons. I think the young Aga Khan at the time was very committed to the idea of change, and saw it happening, and saw that the colonial moment was over, or was ending, and he sets up the nation. And who does he bring to set it up? A whole group of expatriates, mostly from Fleet Street in London. And they take their job very seriously, are very committed to what they're doing. And actually say from the very beginning that they are going to write themselves out of a job in 10 years. Now, the function of what they are
doing at that
why
time.
They're here becomes very interesting from the story of, stories contained in, for instance, Jerry Lafran, who was a former editor of The Nation, did a book during the 60th anniversary called Birth of a Nation. And in the book, he's talking about, the opening chapter of the book, he talks about how, and this kind of just exemplifies what Denis was saying. He opens with this scene at the Serena, which has just been opened up in 1976. And it is Jomo Kenyatta, Udi Geshaga, Gengi Mungai, who's just returned from the US where he was studying, and the Aga Khan. And basically, the president is there to ask the Aga Khan for a favor, which is make my nephew, Gengi, chairman of your media group. Udi Geshaga is chairman of the Standard Group. He's chairman of Loan Group. So, like, right there and then, if you want a story about what the place and the function, perceived function of the media was, and continues to be, we can talk about that. There you have it.
Negotiation between elites.
Precisely.
Yes. Lindy, I want to bring you in the conversation now. Some of what we're talking about is not unique to Kenya. it's reflected all across the continent. And as a South African living and working in Kenya, you cover a continent for an international audience. But when we think about that phrase, colonial narratives or colonial legacies in media reporting, a lot of times what we think of is how foreign correspondents cover Africa, right? That is one space that we might think that these narratives or that kind of phrase is exemplified the most in a way that is most living today. Kenyans know this thing of what Kenyans on Twitter do, right? I don't want to get into that. But when we talk about colonial narratives, how African people are framed, how this continent of ours is kind of described and framed in the eyes of the world, what are some of these persistent narratives about Africa that emerge uncritically in the way that stories are reported today? When we were preparing for this panel, I was thinking about recent reporting in Ukraine. What would you have to say about that?
Well, I certainly don't think we need to look very far, right? There's Ukraine, there's the way Africa was spoken of and reported on during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in the early days. But focusing specifically on Ukraine, what seems to be emerging, especially in conversations about the humanitarian crisis, is this global wave of empathy towards civilians and refugees in Ukraine, which is justified. Civilians and refugees deserve that level of empathy, that level of attention for what they're going through. But of course, there are refugees and victims of conflict in these types of crises all over the world, certainly many here in Africa. You don't need to look beyond Ethiopia, Somalia, the CAR, Mali, and of course the Middle East, Syria, Afghanistan. There's ongoing struggles that people are facing and yet do not receive the same kind of attention and certainly not the same kind of empathy. And I think if we just narrow it down to how we talk about refugees, you'll find that in a lot of foreign media reporting, we always frame it in terms of a crisis. We frame it in terms of fundamentally illegal activity. We talk about the numbers not to say, oh my gosh, so many people are in trouble, but look at these hordes, these masses of Africans scaling or storming a fence as though there's imminent danger, right, to the place where they're arriving to. And so you see that in one sense, people are given the rights and the space to be human, but in another, there's something else, maybe not quite human, right? And this takes us back to those colonial narratives, these binaries that have never quite stopped. That on the one hand, you have the civilized, and on the other hand, you have the barbarian. And this is exactly what's probably being unearthed by the Bunk team, right? These colonial photographs, these colonial magazines, these periodicals were written precisely to share a story with the empire, to say, look at the wonderful things we're doing there in Africa. And that required saints and sinners. It required a Christian and a heathen. It required a civilized person and a barbarian. And these things persist in the way that we try and do media today. It's a challenge because it's not as if that media companies are not trying to do better. There's changes in staffing. There's changes in terms of diversity and inclusive staffing of newsrooms in the foreign media space. There's attempts to reframe things. So let's not call this group of people illegal migrants. Let's call them asylum seekers, which is fundamentally what they are, right? They're not doing anything illegal. They're looking for a safe place to be. There's efforts to, as I said, there's efforts to reframe these narratives. But it's clear that so much more work needs to be done. It's clear that we haven't fully humanized Africans and the African experience of pain and suffering. And that we haven't unseated the power of whiteness fundamentally. And I'll just add one last thing. I was listening to a podcast recently. A woman named Glennon Doyle, a white woman, is interviewing, I think her name is Dr. Ajay Blay. I can't remember fully what her name is, but she's an incredible sociologist, an academic, an activist. And they're talking about white fragility and white tears. And Dr. Blay says, that we're conditioned to respond to white tears. The world is conditioned to respond to white tears. But if a black woman is crying, because they're talking specifically about women, the world is not conditioned the same way. And in fact, the world doesn't respond at all in the same way. It's almost as if it's something that you can ignore because this person might not be completely human. So that is the big challenge, to humanize African experiences and stories and to unseat that very, stubborn power of whiteness.
Lindy, if I'm to put what you just said in conversation with what Denis and Parselelo just shared, if you're to think of international media still as a space of elite conversations and negotiations, why should we think that they would be interested in our humanity? At the end of the day, it's a power play. And what they do with those stories about Africa, like you said, is in the colonial, I guess, in the colonial kind of imagination. It's feeding into that whole imperial colonial impulse anyway, right? And how much of that just remains today? That are we reaching too much to think that they would ever be interested in a different story about Africa if the logic of the media in the first place is this space of elite contestation?
That's a really tough question. I don't think that we should stop attempting to change the narrative, but the audience is perhaps bigger than sending news to the West, right? We're also having conversations amongst ourselves, and we don't fail all the time at this. I think we've been able to build conversations that certainly humanize Africans and place us in positions of comparative. I think we're trying to, in a sense, move away from this idea that Africans are just pawns in some geopolitical power play between bigger countries. And I think it does come up. There is an onus on us to an extent to understand and own our position, and fight for it, and to remember that the audience is bigger than just the West. These stories will always be important, whether the West hears them or not, whether they read them or not. It's important that they're told. It's important that they're written. It's important that these things are documented.
Parselelo, as we were preparing for this panel, we were talking about this idea of why we should even expect this kind of like nuanced coverage about Africa in the first place, right? And you talked about the way, right now, the way we get stories in the newspaper today about what's happening in Africa is through wire services. The Nation reprints stories from Reuters and AFP, and you had this very vivid picture of stories about Africa travel the same route that planes travel through Europe, that there are some cities that you cannot connect directly to. You have to fly to Lisbon or to fly to Germany or to London to connect, right? The same is like, if I need a story about what's happening in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, does my story need to kind of have this kind of airline route? And I want you to just expound on that idea and what you think about that kind of structure of movement of stories and how you process what could be different and how.
Look, it's a quite dire situation. And it's dire because it has existed for so long. Today, on this continent, if you were looking for news about Ethiopia, where there's been a terrible war, where would you get that news from? Probably, most likely, the BBC.
BBC.
And if you're in a French-speaking country, RFI, Radio France International.
Yep.
Right? That is the standard. If you look at the kind of Pan-African print media space, and I worked for both of them, so I know there are two families, actually, both from Tunisia, that for the last 60 years have been controlling commercial Pan-African media. But these are the spaces where every African of a certain generation living on this continent used to get their African news. That's the New African in London and Groupe Jeune Afrique in Paris.
Yes.
Those are the terms of engagement. We continue to exist simply because of what we were talking about earlier, the function of the media. in these places as just prosecuting these elite, these elite conversations or conversations amongst elites, and using the audience as cannon fodder, basically. The people, I can, I've got mine, you've got yours, I can blast yours to Smith kind of thing. But the media, much less than even travel, we are still wedded to the old colonial structures in terms of how we relate to each other on this continent. We know very little about our next door neighbors, much less so about anybody further afield, including people in the same kind of, what do we call them, REC, regional economic community, including, and these, the reason for that is the patterns that were entrenched during colonialism and have basically remained the same.
When you think of a publication like The East African, which I started my career out in, I always imagined, of course, when you start out in journalism, you're very optimistic about everything. Those were good years that I worked for the East African. I always imagined that the East African would become or would grow into this alternative space that would challenge this thing that you're talking about, that you could be able to be assigned to Kisangani or, I'm just like, okay, I'm here in the trenches, but like in 3 years' time, I'm going to be in Kisangani, Denis, you also worked in these kind of big Kenyan media houses. Kenyans generally have this very parochial nature when it comes to media reporting. We are caught up in our local issues in a way that even makes the East African look like an outlier in some ways. But over the years, publications like that have never really, in my idealistic mind, kind of fulfilled their potential, right? And it was only later that, of course, you get to know these structural issues, this kind of long-standing problems that almost make that dream a fantasy. How would you respond to that?
I think it's a question of, as you mentioned, too much naivety and excitement to expect much. And as Lindy and Baraza have said, or have ended there, the media is a question of an ecosystem. This ecosystem we seem to be expecting the public, including journalists, seem to be expecting too much of or from this ecosystem when its terms and idea of existence is completely opposite. We are expecting we are like guys who you buy a zebu, then you want milk production of a freshen. They invested as a continent. Walking back to Lindy's and Baraza's point, there's no singular investment. Like there's not been an African-wide AU or AU. If news really mattered, if journalism mattered to governments or to Africa, they would have invested in an African outlet. In fact, we should be grateful that the CSR by Reuters, AFP, is helping us to get news. Yeah. Then you walk back, you look at what's the public expectation of news from Africa. You write, at this particular moment, a kid is dying maybe in Rio Valley, or a man has been shot dead. That will be a brief story in if it makes news at all. If somebody was...
It will be county roundup.
Yes. If somebody was killed in Kileleshwa outside this road, it will be news. So the idea is that our framing of news is not only parochial, but it's also stratified. Such that if depending on the seniority or status of the person, then importance accrues to it. So if you reported, or in my years in the newsroom, I always got a fascination seeing the foreign journalists pushing the human interest stories, asking us, all these stories, why are you not writing about? So they come say, you guys, every day you report about politics. Why are you not reporting about all these things we are seeing here that will change lives? You listen to them and say, good idea, but you report the things that matter to Kenya every day. You won't sell your paper, nobody will watch your television. People want just hyperbole or things from outer politics. So the reality is that even as a mentality, using Kenyans newspaper readers as a case study, the expectations of what they want from the media and the reality of what they really want in news are extremes. And this comes, I believe, again from the legacy of the colonial archive or leadership, which was inherited and maintained by the African government. So in fact, we need to walk back from blame. The colonial guys put the archive that was fit for service. Our people have got it and made it even stronger, more insular. Thank you.
You began by saying that the story of the Kenyan people and Kenyan life is found on the margins, on the fringes, and in rumors, right? Do you see that when you think about what Bunk is trying to do here with the Missing Bits project, of actually curating and crowdsourcing those stories, and in your experience in the newsroom, that there will always be a limited space for those kind of things. I remember, every journalist has gone through this. Anyone who has been a reporter on the ground maybe is assigned to cover an accident, a road accident that has happened, for example, right? And you can see what you're seeing with your own eyes, but your editor will always ask you for a quote from the OCPD or the local police person, right? And you said to me as we were preparing for this panel, in some ways the colonial enterprise robbed people of the ability to speak on their own behalf. So for example, officialdom has to come and say, there was an accident here, 5 people have died, 3 have been taken to hospital, that your story is not complete, it's not credible, it's not a thing until you have that voice in there. You framed this as the politics of knowledge and power. Could you unpack that a little for us?
I was speaking to the situation where the individual voice doesn't really matter. I was trying to move away from the binaries of the West, and by getting to the local example. For instance, if Raila stood up today and said, my house has been broken into, it will be news all over. If I stood up and said, my house has been broken into, and asked, have you reported to a police station? Where's the evidence? If a woman, with due respect to all of us here, if you reported you have been assaulted, lady, we've asked, and the reporter called and says, we've asked, okay, where's the evidence? If, depending again on status, it will be taken. So it means that this is a process that started at many years ago under the colonial regime, where because the official express of the media, this was a platform for conversation between the ruling or the power elites. The masses became, or the public was to be listened to or to be directed. So as such, the public preserving their own agency, because the masses are always brilliant than we want to presume. And this is what we got from our study of the news cultures in Africa. So people found alternative narratives of keeping their lives or recording their lives and living. So, and that's why the question of rumor and gossip becomes very important. And that's why this idea of the book bank, going to ask guys to remember what was happening at these key junctures in life. Yeah, that's why that's a very good idea, because the purpose of an archive now, when you have a very adulterated public space where some voices have been historically locked out, yeah, you cannot create a whole by insisting on a matrix that says, where is the evidence? So we say that so you should collect all the archives, all the narratives. So whether we are getting from the colonial archive or whether from the daily newspapers or TV or for individual narratives.
Personal stories, yeah.
It's important because collectively, each says a different version, which will, in the future, someone looking at it can say, this is how Kenyan life was. So to get a Kenyan story, how it was at independence, the activities happening in these lands may bring a dynamic that the history books never captured. The dynamic that the papers or the mass media never captured. And remember, when I started, I said that the media erases history and not records, because each day we publish, or less than 10% of the news of the day is published. Yeah. And the decision of what is published or not published is not in black and white.
So the existence of the 10% implies that the 90% didn't happen.
Didn't happen.
Right.
So you are excluding the majority, preserving a few. So for what? So that's why you need archives that complement each other. So that way now, the knowledge will not come from an exclusive source, but it will be powered by the mix of different voices and diversity. Thank you.
I'm going to open this up for the first round of questions. So as the mic is going round, maybe 2 or 3 questions. I can see a hand here at the front. Just a comment. If it's a comment, make it brief. If it's a question, make it direct. Is that that's a good guideline, yeah? If it's a comment, make it brief. If it's a question, make it direct. Don't beat around the bush. I see 2 hands here at the front. 3 actually, so we'll take these 3 questions. I'll ask, does Jonathan have the mic? Yeah. Good. So we'll just collect the questions and then we'll let the panel speak or address them.
My name is John Oma. I'm a newspaper columnist. And my question revolves around the media system. If the audience for which the Kenyan journalists, and by extension African journalists, are writing for, if they suffer from the mythology of the free press, quote unquote, what does the ABLE panel think about the feasibility of having a media system that is not for profit and say public funded? And if that is to be the case, does the panel think that would be enough to address what sometimes I call the poverty of alternative narrative?
Thank you. Thank you. That was a direct question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Reimagining, a communication student and a budding writer. My question is direct to the 4 of you on the panel. That I'd love to know what recommendations can the panelists make to restore the primary role of the storytelling in the media and discard the elite, what you call the contestation of the elites in the media space. So what recommendation do you make so that we reduce the domination of the elite and the real African stories are told? Thank you.
The lady behind you, in the row behind.
Hi, my name is Sheila, an intern at Bunk, working with the digitization team. And my question is there something that is being done to make sure that 50 years from now, we are not at the same point where we are trying to speak to the elderly or find out the happenings of what we are doing right now? Is there something happening or what can be done?
Sheila, you have, this is my question. Your question is here. What do we need to do today so that in 2060, we are not doing this same thing? We are not doing another missing bits project in 2060 to address the gaps that we are creating today. Parselelo, maybe you could take the first question about non-profit publicly funded media, and Denis, the second question about what can we do to make it more about telling the stories rather than the elite contestation. Sheila, I'm going to park your question, and I'm going to address it to the panel after these two questions are done. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Yeah. Let me start by saying that I think it's not quite fair to overemphasize this kind of binary between commercial and non-commercial, and thinking that one might contain the solution because the other doesn't. Actually, what you're talking about is a question of control. Who is actually controlling that media space? We have cultures in this country which will continue to breed and reproduce a kind of elitism, which would mean that certain whatever is in the frame is really a kind of reproduced self-image of the person controlling the production of images, and metaphors. So it really is not, and I don't want to go into too many details and talk about direct experience, but it's really not about whether it's a commercial or non-commercial one. It's a question of where the media is coming from. I think there was a point in the life of kind of liberalized media before it was well and truly captured by the oligarchy, when there was a kind of groundswell of community media, and there were quite a lot of very positive, very progressive initiatives happening in that kind of space. What has happened since, I don't know, but you don't hear too much about it. I mean, of media houses that came from that background, I'm thinking of Ghetto Radio, have done quite well. But then again, one would, being a good journalist, one would want to go behind the scenes and find out what the real story is. So just to round that up, really it is about the mission. It is about the project. It's not about the kind of financing or even non-financing model. I don't know whether that answers your question.
I think it does. We think beyond that binary, that commercial for profit has necessarily different results from publicly funded non-profit, right?
Precisely.
That it's a kind of like a bigger thing that is controlling the machinery and not that kind of binary framing. Denis, on our friend's question there about elite contestation versus storytelling, like you said in your earlier comments, if you go and collect these human interest stories, you don't sell your newspaper. I know that has been your experience, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I was there. I know it was your experience. You can't say it.
Yeah. the reality is always humbling. At the end of the day, media is a business. So if we appreciate that the investments, the media houses we see around are first and foremost investments, then we'll also appreciate the logic of how they manage and commission their stories. There is a lot of hope that storytelling is improving, and every day you see the evidence that debunks the myth that Kenyans don't read or write, or Africans don't read or write. So there is increased creativity. If you walked back to the 90s, everybody will tell you how previous newspapers and radio stations and TVs were doing great documentaries or had great writers, which is true to an extent. But if you sift through those audio and print archives, you'll be amazed at the creativity, the new storytelling, or the depth of narrative being born out of the newer, fresh writers. So there's hope. And the advantage of the moment is that the technology has personalized journalism. So we have individuals creating their own archives every day. So perhaps in 60 years we'll have this problem of we are looking today. So the question of elite contestation, that's the reality, because those are the owners of the news and the owners of the means of production. Yeah, so I don't see much going to change there. Yeah, but I see new voices exploring new ways of telling their stories. So there's hope.
Go ahead.
Just to follow up on that, Denis. What would a media space look like outside a capitalist setup? I mean, because that's really where the question is going, isn't it?
Yeah. I think it may look like a mortuary. Because it will be a good signpost of there's a failed attempt. Because media is capital intensive. Yeah, that's the reality which people, unless you've been in the industry, generating news and getting news to where it should be is capital intensive. And you need to ask yourself, what is your personal interest in the assumed public that you want to get this news to everybody for free? Ask yourself, why is the paper that's being given out for free among the least circulating? Yeah, so there are dynamics here, but at the end of the day, any hope of having an independent media house, not for profit, unless bankrolled by a billionaire, a dollar billionaire, has little chance. And this town is littered with broken dreams of journalists. Every journalist joins the newsroom very excited they're going to change. After 3 years, they say, I'm going to found my own thing. This younger generation below 35, if they're honest, they'll tell you of their frustrations of trying to change the system they found us in. So,
Lindy, I see you have something to...
Yeah, just a small thing to add to that is that, yes, media is an investment. Yes, there are these power dynamics, and we have to think about ways of unseating that power. But so I had a conversation with a colleague in the industry who also works for international media, and it made me think about the commercialization of stories, and eventually who are we selling these stories to? Yes, the elite want to see themselves reflected in this investment of theirs, but she was telling me that when former President Daniel Arap Moi died, they were prepared, they had a eulogy ready, a story about his life and his legacy, and they put it out on air, they put it on their digital channels, and it didn't get a lot of traction. So they went back to try and see, what did we miss? Where did we go wrong? they went through all the Google Analytics where Moi's name comes up, and the #1 search was, who is Daniel Arap Moi? Because the median age of African news, well, Africans, the median age of Africa is 19. 20-year-olds are seeing news, consuming news, but their first question is, who is this person?
Who's this guy?
Exactly.
Yeah.
By the time his presidency ended, in what, 2002, right?
2002. That's when they were being born.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And then after that, when they had like a session with the interns and the younger people in the office, they asked him, what are you really curious about? They were like, well, he's got other kids from other people that aren't his wife, so who are those? Who's the mother of these children? Where did his money come from? You know what I mean?
Like
this was what, that's what they wanted to know. Life, legacy, policies, they weren't interested. And to be honest, we're going to be forced to think about how do we commercialize this? And it's going to force us to unseat some of that power dynamic, some of that conversation that's just between the elite. Because the audience is young, very, very, very young. And yeah, that's something we have to.
But that's interesting because would you have imagined that that is the target audience of legacy media?
Probably not. But how do we continue to create media without considering this fact that the median age is 19?
No. I think,
Dennis.
Oh, are you asking a question? It seems to me that so-called legacy media moved on a long time ago from those kinds of tricky questions and focuses on whatever traditional audience it has amongst the corporate elite, the political establishment, and those kinds of people, and really not much more than that. And I'm talking about this from the perspective, maybe Denis would want to add something to it, from the perspective of the puzzle of a disappearing audience. I think it was Charles Obo a few years ago.
Yep.
He was head of digital convergence. Or was he just I don't know what the title was at the Nation Media Group. And I was having a conversation with him, and he says, look, in 1988, the nation was reaching anywhere between 300 and 500,000 people on its best days. We come from the perspective that the middle class audience has grown exponentially since then. Our numbers have fallen, dramatically. So where has this audience gone? The other kind of layer to that question is, especially at a time when traditional media have kind of full spectrum dominance. They control everything from the broadcasting space, the digital space, the print space, and online. And yet, these numbers keep falling. What is happening here? And this is not, I'm not asking it as a kind of, sales and marketing question, but as a really, as a phenomenon that I think needs to be unpacked. If we're to kind of understand what people are actually reading and looking at.
I see Odanga there at the back. And I think, I saw your hand earlier, but I think you have an answer to Parselelo's question of where has the audience gone? This is work that you've done extensively, and you can tell us, where did the audience disappear to?
Yummy Mami.
Yeah. Young, famous, and African.
Young, famous, and African. I mean, the big question of where audiences have gone is, because what I feel like the debate that's going on here also is, the time-old question, right? Do we dictate what the audience should be reading, or does the audience dictate to us what we should be reading, right? And I feel like there's also going to be a very fundamental shift in media as we put up paywalls to the kind of content, because I've always believed that the biggest problem with the kind of content and what we receive, that whole thing of being talked at, is largely because majority of the news we consume is consumed for free. Most of us don't have a single unit that we can say, I have paid to receive. Like, very rarely will you find Kenyans saying that they are actually paying for the news that they receive. The number one. So that, in essence, is really affecting, the kind of information that is coming to them. But one thing that is very clear is that audiences, yes, for the time age, time-old thing, audiences are moving away from traditional media and moving on to digital media. But it's also not just that simple, because even when they move on to digital media, they're not coming to legacy media. They're not coming to Citizen TV. They're not coming to Nation. They're definitely not going to the Star or Standard. They're looking for Zari, right? They're looking for Zari. And there's a big recognition here. How many of you have heard the craziest story of last week was that the White House is now briefing TikTok? Is now briefing TikTokers about the war in Ukraine ahead of White House correspondence, right? There's a big shift that's happening, and the definition of what trust in media looks like for an 18-year-old is not the same definition of what trust in media looks like for a person like you and I. So there's a big question there. For some people, it causes a moral panic of what is happening to our young people. They don't want to watch the news anymore.
They want to watch influencers.
Yeah, they want to watch Kanye and Zari and Andile and the rest of those people. So there's this small slight panic that's going on. But what I learned from just observing all of this is, I disagree with Denis on the idea that Kenyans only want to consume political news. From the data that I have seen, they're actually tired of it. If you look at majority of the content that people are engaging with on a very minute and micro level, on most of the news sites, especially on social media, which is where they spend the majority of their time, if not 80% of their time, it's the story of a KCPE boy who's walked 200 kilometers in order to get an A in his grades. It's the story of, you get the kind of stories that I'm talking about, very real human interest stories. And so there's a real opportunity there. And that's not to say that those stories are not political. They're political in every single way, right? So there's a more nuanced question and method that we need to apply here. And I know, of course, someone will counter me and say, but that's only for digital. But I think it can still apply across the board. Think of Patanisho and Radio Jambo, right? Like, that's human interest, right? But presented in an interesting comedic way, but that is human interest. And that's one of Radio Africa's biggest shows. So how do we learn from that, right? And of course, eventually, because media is a business, how do we make money from that? Yeah.
Christine.
Yes, Denis, go for it.
No, thank you for your comments. I agree with you 52%. And yeah.
More than half.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. One, the Nation and the Standard between 98 and perhaps this year, they've done more than 200 market research on what do readers want. What do young people want? In my own stint at Nation, we had an adventure with an entire newspaper. We did a national survey. What do readers want? What voices are not in public media spaces? And two things came up. There are no women. There are no young people. Then you said, do a newspaper that speaks to women and then youth. Did lots of national focus groups, all those engagements, and the Saturday paper was changed as a women's newspaper. The failure was spectacular. Two, virtually every quarter, there is research coming out about audience preferences. And top on the list by Kenyans is tell us news that will develop us. Give us news that matter to our lives. You go out, TV stations and newspapers have tried to implement that. And you get a truckload of returns. You put a story that is largely bullshit, political, and it sells. What does this tell us? One, public opinion is a fickle tool for planning in a culture where people posture to tell you what you want, what they think you want to hear, where people are striving to be politically correct. Two, we have, if you look collectively at there's this much talk of saying that the people are shifting to digital spaces outside or away from the dominant media narratives. That is only true if you don't want to make to get the bigger numbers of the bigger picture of the transition. Yes, Patanisho is important, but Patanisho is part of the enterprise, like for the hegemony of the media. For the dominant media houses have realized that you can't live on one stream of income. So they are evolving and mutating themselves into. So you get that Patanisho is still big. Standard has Head Crazy Monday, Head the Nairobian. You have the site, the Standard website became so popular because they were telling you you want to enlarge ABCDE, you want to get XYZ. So those are clickbaits. But if you look at the attention of the readers, you still find that political stories take a lot of attention. And the reason here is because politics in Kenya is business, is education, is life. So the aspiration, how the dominance has clouded much of everything else in life. So research, my point to the brilliant comments the young man made was that media houses every day grapple with the research. You execute and it burns your fingers. But they keep on evolving. So thank you.
Thank you for that. I am going to take a second round, but not right now. I want to ask the panel my second to last round of questions. So actually, it's one question. So just keep your comments. We're going to come back to the audience, starting with Odanga, who has something to say. But before I allow a second and final round of Q&A, I want to ask each of you, how can we imagine a new archive? It's another way of answering Sheila's question. In 60 years' time, are we going to be doing another Missing Bits project? Is it inevitable that there's always going to be gaps in this work? Is there a way that we can create a new archive, including using media sources and decisions that we are making in the moment? Or is it inevitable that in 60 years' time, we're going to be filling in the gaps at that time, filling in the decisions that we are making today, having the same conversation decades down the line? Lindy, what do you think?
I do think there will be another conversation like this, in the future. I think it's inevitable. We were talking earlier about how what we know about the situation in Russia and Ukraine right now will inevitably change in 10, 15 years from now. Somebody will do a documentary. There will be books written that will unearth things that we simply do not know now. Just, you know what I mean? Those gaps there'll always be these gaps, even if we don't see them right now, and they'll need to be filled in the future by journalists of the future. They should continue to do so. But touching on what Denis mentioned about the people that feel like they don't see themselves in the news or are somehow not underrepresented in the news, so youth and women, I think there has to be a conscious effort, especially for people that work in foreign media, to think about how we tell stories and to make sure that we include those voices. So for instance, now there's a lot of attention on the fact that there's a massive drought in the region and that countries like Somalia, even northern Kenya, Ethiopia, are potentially facing massive food shortages that could lead to famine. And already the reporting is starting to look like that kind of reporting we saw 30, 40 years ago, right? The baby with kwashiorkor, you know what I mean, the frail mom trying to take care of a very, very sick child. And it seems like we haven't, just the imagery of how we portray Africans in a difficult time hasn't actually changed. But where is the 17-year-old in this, internally displaced persons camp? Where is the 19-year-old in this place? What are they doing? How are they dealing with water shortages? Or why don't we tell that story of that person? Let's start filling in the gaps now. Let's stop ignoring the fact that, there's youth, there's women who may have a different way to talk about what's actually happening. Yeah.
Parselelo, what do you think? Is it inevitable that we're going to be filling in the gaps? Or are the gaps going to change not in the existence of a gap, but what type of gap it is? Is it going to be a different kind of missing story or the same?
Well, one of the failures and one of the really formidable things, both failure and also very formidable things about the colonial and post-colonial archive. The post-colonial archive is actually not open as such, right? We're having this conversation because the colonial archive is accessible, right? Now, the failure of the colonial archive ultimately was not its kind of inherently racist basis, but it was actually the idea that it could accurately depict a situation, a colony, a people, through bureaucrats and through bureaucratic records. I mean, think about it. It's absurd. It's silly. But it was in other places where records are accessible. That archive is complemented by private personal archives. What has happened for us over here, I'm sorry I'm taking us through around the houses, but what has happened over here is that our big men and women were themselves archives. And there is an inbuilt culture, very post-colonial culture, for people to die without saying anything. Because, you are part of Sirikali also. And so the difficulty of depicting the past and accurately discovering and reassembling it is those kinds of gaps. Now, going forward, what do we have and what can we see? Taking off from something that Denis said earlier about social media and the personalization of the archive, I think that will offer a whole lot more information. Whether I'm not going to discuss whether it's qualitatively or not, but it will offer a whole lot more that information to begin kind of threading that kind of needle of history in 60 years' time. I think my anticipation is that if you're having that if you're going to have that conversation, or if that conversation is going to be had going forward about missing bits, the missing bits will be very much about the kind of national silo filters that we continue to exist in, and that we continue not to be able to break in order to begin deepening and enriching encounters, on this continent and beyond. Breaking out of a kind of big data filters that that we respond to is going to be very much part of that struggle. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I've just laid out a lot of other things.
Denis answered this question at the beginning. How we reimagine a new archive is through rumors and gossip being sources as well. Do you want to add something to that?
The individualization of communication and the multiplicity of voices and also platforms addresses the singular focus of the colonial archive. Then also, the good thing with the trends and the passing of time is that I foresee perhaps in future the problem will be contestation over the post-colonial archive. And that should be the natural progression of order, because the colonial archive has become a convenient excuse for individual and institutional failures. If I fail, or if at a personal level or industry level, even government, people don't live up to expectation, there's an easy strawman, colonialism or structure. But as we move away from that easy scapegoat, and as people get agency, it will be, the next conversations on the archives will be interesting, because they'll not be local. Now we have the advantage of looking outside. Now, yeah, so we'll be facing off.
So going beyond the local. Yeah. Last round of questions. I see that hand. I see that lady at the back there. Someone else? I see Sheila again. We're going to take that round.
So I think based off of just maybe taking us slightly back to the conversation we had, I really just want to beg the people that work in the media to understand that women are not an audience. That they're literally not an audience that you can pinpoint that there's a shared set of values, a shared set of beliefs or anything like that. Like, that's why anytime anyone has tried to set up sort of like niche sort of media section for women, it's always failed. Because in reality, I personally believe there's no such audience as women and there's no such audience as youth, right? They don't exist. And we have to move our audience understanding to sort of go beyond that if we're really going to talk about this whole idea of decolonization. Because think about it again, and that's a large part of how also the colonizers tended to talk at us, right? So we need to sort of think about moving away from these sort of ideals as we think about executing on the kind of research that we want to push. My question maybe to the panel was, if someone was to write you a blank check to try and solve this problem, what are the kind of bets that you would make with our current media environment? I really want to know. I don't know if you're willing to share, but it's a big question, because if I was to give you the money to do it, what would it take for you to do that, to make that kind of change? And how would you give me my money back?
That's one. At the back there.
Thank you. I have sat with Odanga at a table in Naivasha, and I promise you, we really need to look at how young people consume the news, because I bought the papers, he consumed it. He consumed them in a very, very different way from the way that I would. I think the answer lies between the two of you somewhere. It's not only about interest, it's about how. It's about the how as well, and the accessibility and all those kind of things. I wanted to say that I'm really happy about the missing links, and I think the next step, I hope, will be to even take it further. I watched a really interesting video on WhatsApp group from my home area, Maragoli, and a young man interviewing his grandfather about how Maragoli looked, what it was like, what they did, the practices. I think if we leave it only in the archives here, we miss half of the conversation. So I think it's really important to kind of democratize, devolve, kind of get people confident that media, what Denis was talking about is the plethora of media and its availability and the importance of everybody recording their story. Because those perspectives, I think we've kind of been marginalized almost as a whole community from the media, and the sense that we are no longer important, our stories are not important, our actions are not important, our achievements are not important. We need to, revisit, revise, and really get people documenting, because that is the archive. The bigger it is, the better it is. And I just wanted to ask Denis and Pasa, surely you guys have really dissed our media and the efforts that we make every day in there. I think you've spoken of the vested interests that contest the ownership and control of policy at the top, but there are journalists every day in there contesting the space as well and paying a price for it, Even if we look at the issue of just the coverage of women and the voice of women, it is expanding. And it is from contesting it inside, the voice of marginalized communities. So I think you're overly pessimistic about that space. Thank you.
Thank you for that. The importance of the multiplicity of voices. And are we too dark? Are we too pessimistic? Denis will take that.
Thank you once again. Okay, I was having a discussion with my friends on experiences we all had during the post-election violence, and I noticed that most of us, if not all of us, had really different stories and really different experiences, and 90%, if not 100, isn't even documented. So my question is, how is Book Bunk planning on reaching 90%, if not 100% of our grandmothers and great-grandmothers to tell us the stories? Because I feel like storytelling is the only way we can get to learn from them about what happened during that time, because most of them are not even learned. So how is Book Bunk going to get those stories, considering they're from all over Kenya, villages separate, really far away from Nairobi? So, yeah, that's my question.
Thank you. I will take that. I will answer that as the last question. Denis.
Yes. No. Thank you, Ross, for your question. I think you walked in late. Because I thought when I started, I said that our comments or my observations are not on the media today. We acknowledge the efforts being done, but said like the gap is so huge as to be blamed on the current or immediate former crop of journalists. It is a systematic issue. And it started a while back because media reflects what happens in society. And one of the points was saying that there's no singular identity of the Kenyan society. So we can't just say that, similarly, we can't just dismiss what the media does or is not doing. So that was the point of departure. Yeah, but again, looking back at the reality is that the individual efforts are not sufficient enough to occasion change. And perhaps the example that can bring this home is that if you look at coverage of the human interest in Kenya per capita, or on Africa, per capita between the foreign press and the local press, you'll be surprised that the foreign press per capita covers more human interest things in depth than you'll be surprised that right now, the biggest reporter or reportage on the everyday Mwananchi issues in Kenya are by two. Xinhua, or whatever it's pronounced, how do you call it? The Chinese news wire service?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Xinhua.
Xinhua, yeah. And the Kenya News Agency. You'll be surprised that the public perception of the government reportage is dominance and control people. But every day, the government produces the best human interest stories, from education to culture, more than 200 stories. They don't get published anywhere. Yeah. So it's not for lack of effort or news, but how the system is arranged. And speaking to the question about women not being an audience, I disagree. In a situation where you have such extreme margins, you have to categorize gender is a big determinant in what is happening. However, what we can never do is to assume that you have got this blanket thing called women, and women's interests are a singular. So we should aggregate, and I believe the challenge has been on how far and how fast and how sufficient the aggregation is. Thank you.
Thank you. I want Lindy to just respond to something you said there, that Xinhua is one of the biggest sources of human interest stories. You are with CGTN, which is state-run by the Chinese government, and earlier we were talking about foreign coverage of Africa. How different is the quote-unquote Chinese kind of lens on how Africa is covered as compared to kind of the traditional Euro-American axis? And especially with what Denis just said about the emphasis or the amplification of the ordinary Mwananchi stories, if I'm to call it that.
Well, I think CGTN is the English arm of CCTV, right? So the parent company is the Chinese language main broadcaster in China. And in terms of us as the English channel, it's not that CGTN Africa is the sole focus of the existence of CGTN. In fact, in a 24-hour cycle, you'll find that up to about 14 hours a day is still produced from Beijing. And the rest of the hours are split between us in Nairobi, Washington, DC, which is CGTN America, and London, which is CGTN Europe. So primarily, their focus is to change the world's perception of China, to encourage people to look at China differently. Because similarly, they've also suffered from negative narratives about China, their culture, their country, their people, their food. And these are things that they fundamentally want to address. When it comes to having established an Africa Bureau, there is a secondary objective, right? And that is the soft diplomacy objective, which exists with BBC, which exists with a lot of other state broadcasters. But definitely, there's a very particular relationship that is being addressed, the China-Africa relationship. And the soft diplomacy approach is to make friends, to make this relationship look positive. And in that sense, there is a lot of focus on the human interest stories. There is a lot of, I think there's an overt attempt to not present Africa in a negative light. It's not to say that all stories are positive, but I think there is an overt attempt to say this is not like Western media, this is not like we're not listening to you and we're not, you know? And that's achieved in various ways. So obviously through certain types of stories that we do, certain ways in which we handle coverage of controversial issues, a focus on positive stories, but also, and let me just add on the positive stories aspect, is that sometimes it works incredibly well, you know? You find remarkable Mwananchi stories about people in communities doing incredible things, or people in the tech world, or people in sports, or people in fashion, or people in fintech, like really, really, really amazing stories, and they go on air and they're wonderful. But sometimes, I think, and maybe it's some of these Reuters types of stories as well that come into, that we use, you know, and they'll come from Burkina Faso or something like that, and the story will be about FGM, like programs to end FGM, or programs to end early child marriage. And even that very, very positive lens to say, we take, you know, these girls have been taken to an education center where they'll live a better life kind of thing. It has a slightly patronizing tone, which is worrying, right? And there's a challenge to us journalists to be like, you know, we can't be patronizing about this. Painting Africans essentially that we're like victims of our own backwardness, victims of our own culture, and if only we would, you know. But the other thing that I think CGTN does well, and it answers the question of if I had lots of money, how would I structure a newsroom? I do think staffing is key. If you look at, say, CNN specifically, not a lot of African correspondents. You know, there are full-time staff that are actually staff of CNN and are full-time correspondents based on the continent. And that is very, very different with CGTN. Almost all of our correspondents are African, right? There's a couple of, maybe South Africa has a few white faces, but the majority of the faces that you will see on air are black African people. And in that sense, we tell the stories of the world around us. We tell the stories about, people in our age cohort or in our gender, or, we look to recognize people like ourselves in the stories that we tell. And it also influences who we speak to as experts and voices of, wisdom and wonder, whatever. Like when I'm looking for an expert to speak to, I'm more likely to look at my, in my world, right? I'm not looking for some sense that the wisdom is coming from the West. So I do think that's, a couple of things that CGTN gets right, but of course doesn't get everything right.
Pasa, why don't you take the question of if you had a blank check? What kind of bets?
That's the exact question I didn't want to take.
That's the exact answer I want to hear.
I don't know. I think I'm keen on, give me that blank check. I'd like to set up a Pan-African media platform that is fundamentally interested in a kind of Africans talking to each other, and just having those and developing stories from the ground up, rather than stories either looking at your kind of elite authorities, or just looking at stories on this. I don't know how far I'd go with that, but I'd just be interested in breaking the mold and having those conversations going.
Sheila's question was about how do we get all these stories from far and wide, right? I'm going to answer that by saying that we start with where we are, right? What Book Bunk is inviting us to do is to contribute to the archive, right? Bring your family albums, your older relatives, the stories from your family, and begin there, right? And this idea that what we do here in a small way is only valid when we've gone and gotten the remote stories, I think is something that it's an expectation or a demand that is placed on us that acts to make us feel like what we are doing here now is not enough, right? Remember that the Colonial Archive actually never captured all the stories, right? It never captured all the histories. It was never interested in the whole thing. And for us, if we feel like what we are doing now is small and is invalid because it doesn't have everyone's story from everywhere, I think that even if that critique is valid, it should not stop us from starting now, right? It should not stop us from gathering those stories where we are right now, and which is a big part of, which actually is the rationale of the Missing Bits project. When you look at what's actually missing, perhaps we'll never be able to fill in the gap entirely, right? And the work is always incomplete. I believe that the work will always be incomplete. But that critique of what you're doing is incomplete should not dampen our enthusiasm to contribute to it now. I hope that answers your question. I know that many of us come from families where we had family photo albums in the living room that were given to visitors when they came for entertainment. How cool is that? That photo album was a form of entertainment, right? Where you could bring out what, Pastor, you called earlier, stock stories, stock narratives. You know those stories that families are always saying? I know each of your families has like things that people are always talking about, right? These are the kind of narratives and histories that we want to see represented in the archive and that Book Bunk is inviting you to be a part of. So on that good note, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for making the time to be here. I don't take it for granted that you got up from wherever you are and brought yourself here. So thank you for being part of this conversation. Thank you for your attention and your questions, your insights, and your contributions. I want to say a very big thank you to our panel. Thank you, Parselelo. Thank you, Lindy. Thank you, Denis, for honoring our invitation, for agreeing to be here. And I also want to thank Book Bunk for putting together not only this panel in partnership with Baraza Media Lab, but also this project, which I think its implications are going to be bigger than what we can envision right now. On that note, do we have Jonathan or Marianne from Book Bunk? Yeah, there you, Jonathan is coming. Again, my name is Christine Mungai. This is Baraza Media Lab. We host conversations like this, so you can follow us on our socials to catch up with what we are doing here. This panel, in partnership with Book Bunk, is the first of 3. And so there'll be a second panel in the middle of April that we're going to host at Macmillan Memorial Library in CBD. Let me just say, Macmillan is one of those places where when I was a student in primary and high school, I used to tell myself when I finish Form 4, I'm going to spend my time in Macmillan. Like I had this whole library plan that I was going to do in 1 year. Like that was going to be like my existence. Like I would be a library geek, right? And then I went there and I was so creeped out. Like I was so creeped out. Which is why the work that Book Bunk is doing, restoring public libraries, is so exciting for me. I can finally live my dream of being that library lounge geek person. And the last event is going to be held at Eastlands Library in Makadara. And in that panel, we're going to be talking about decolonizing the arts and culture space. And that panel is going to be a bigger kind of festival with music, with art, with all kinds of things going on that Jonathan will tell you about. So follow Book Bunk to keep up with the ticketing and the dates for these 2 events that are coming up, and for all the other events that are part of the Missing Bits project, including film screenings, which will be part of the next 2 installments, the crowdsourcing of the narratives, which is ongoing at Eastlands, the music festival, and all the other things that the Missing Bits is going to be doing. On that note, and asanteni sana. Jonathan?
Okay, thank you. Once again, asanteni sana to the panel, to Christine, that was phenomenal. A lot of things to think about. And also as a communications professional, even just how we storytell and we kind of capture the stories, which part of the narratives are we forgetting, or which part of the narratives are we not spotlighting? So our engagement with media as well, how do we tell this, how do we approach them? So as part of this, there's a question that came to the public I just felt I should respond to. This is part of a series of community engagement sessions that we are doing. Beyond that, we're also working with a media buyer and a media planning company. So we'll be getting a lot of TikTokers and influencers, kind of inviting them to also see this archive, participate in it. We'll have a series of activations. Beyond that, so for the festival, the first one is on April the 23rd on Saturday. I believe all of you signed up to a newsletter, so you'll be getting a bit of material about that. That will be happening at the main branch in Macmillan. Then on 21st May, that's when we'd have the final session. For that festival, we'd have panel sessions, music, an exhibition that will be done by the Nest Collective. There's a music curation, which is a historical musical playlist that you can find on YouTube already, on our socials, at the Book Bunk, across all our platforms. It's also on Spotify, working to get it on iTunes, so you should be able to also collate and see what kind of music Kenyans were listening to in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, and the 70s. And the description to kind of what that music meant and what it entailed. So please do also check that out. In the meantime, feel free to go to the libraries. we're still inviting people to digitize. Starting from next week on the 31st, we will begin the audio storytelling. We're specifically targeting especially anyone who's 60 plus, because we realize there's such a small number. There, I think less than 1 million in the country, of people who are like 60 plus and have knowledge about what life was like pre-independence. So feel free to sign up and come to the library to add to your stories. We'll really appreciate that. Asanteni sana, have a lovely night and travel safe.
My name is Leslie Musyoki, and we've had the conversation on colonial legacies and media reporting, and it's all about how things have changed prior to how things were during our colonial times. You know, nowadays it's just online platforms, and nobody cares about what Citizen talks about. The youth are just focused on these other streams of media, and I think old is gold, so we just have to go back there and tell our stories our own way on podcast, and it's just going to be the best thing to source our own stories from back then, and the youth will benefit much more from that.
Hi, my name is Sharon Mashira, and yeah, I really enjoyed this session. I learned a lot. I think what really stood out for me was the conversation about who dictates the editorial agenda. Is it the journalists and the media houses, whether they were from back in the day during the colonial times, or is it the public? And I think what we see in modern times with younger people, because of social media and technology, it's almost democratized. So if for me as a young person, I don't care about what's in the mainstream news agenda, I just get on TikTok, Instagram, whatever, and understand what's going on there. So I think it was interesting for us to have the conversation around who controls the narrative or who sets the agenda. Is it young people or is it media houses? And I think it was interesting to tie it back to the colonial times when, they held the power and there was no other form of, media besides just newspapers that were controlled by white elitists, basically. So it's interesting to see how things have changed now, and I think I'm really curious to see how young people respond to this conversation when you share the videos online.
Hi, my name is Reimagining. I'm a communication student. Today we had a conversation on Colonial Legacy on media reporting, and for me, I think it's a conversation we needed to have a long time ago. So I'm really privileged to be a part of this. One thing I'd say is that the conversation has just opened my eyes to understand that the media, without the capitalistic approach of it, is as equal as dead, from one of our panelists said. And I want to believe that from this is a great win, not just for my age mates and people who experience a certain gap in how they understand stuff out here, but I think also for those of us who will like to look back into history when we are growing old. Yeah, I think I really commend this and be a part of this more and more and more again. Thank you.
My name is Rose Lucalo Owino. I'm a former journalist. I also do a lot of media development work. I loved being here. It really was an eye-opener, and I'm really, really impressed at the work that's being done. It made me feel like, first of all, it made me aware that there's a gap, which I wasn't really aware of before, and really just questioning the work that we do every day in the media. It did make me think. Missing Bits project, I think, is such a valuable tool, and I think it goes beyond even what they're doing with the libraries. I'd like to see everybody across the country just documenting their own experiences, because they're so valuable. And I think sometimes in the rush of today, people forget that they're doing important things, that what little they're doing is contributing to the big pie. So I think it's really important as a historical record when people come back to look at what happened during their time. Whatever you said you did will be there for them to look at.